Thanks everyone for joining. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes. We're going to give other folks a chance to hop on, get situated, and we'll wait those 2 minutes. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to webinar week for SpecterOps, and thanks for joining me today. I hope that you and your loved ones are safe and definitely in good health. So this week, we'll have a series of webinars on a number of different topics across all of our service lines. And if you're not familiar with SpecterOps, in general, our service lines are adversary detection, the team that I'm on, adversary simulation, and adversary resilience. So we'll get into talks from all three lines this week. And the webinar today is actually designed to help detection and response teams who traditionally work from home, work from an office, like on site, and now they must conduct their operations remotely. So just for everyone's awareness, this session will be recorded as well. So if you need to drop off for some reason, don't worry, it'll be recorded and it'll be disseminated shortly after the webinar. With that, I will show the slide about myself. I am Richie Cyrus, a manager on the adversary detection services team. So a lot of folks don't know that SpecterOps does defense. We're very well known for the offensive tooling that we put out, but there are a number of members on the team defensively, Jared Atkinson, Robbie Winchester, Jonathan Johnson, who have put out some blog posts in the past months that have been foundational to the way that some of the industry thinks about defense. Specifically, we'll get into this during the presentation, the funnel of Fidelity. So we'll talk about that in a few slides here. But the adversary detection services team in general provides training in the form of our adversary tactics detection course. And so we teach that course publicly as well as privately. And so outside of that, our bread and butter is what we call program development. And that's where we conduct maturity assessments to identify problem areas in defensive programs. And we've done a bunch of different tasks for our clients to help them improve their program. Some of those tasks being augmenting tier 3 staff, build-in detections in clients' environments, as well as helping to restructure their security operations teams. One thing that we also do as well, that we don't do a ton of, but we do, are compromise assessments. So that's basically what we do in a nutshell. This presentation itself will scratch the surface of what we covered during program development services. So with that, we're going to get to the cornerstone concept around a lot of our defensive services here at SpecterOps. That being the funnel of fidelity. So the funnel of fidelity is a concept that was created by Jared Atkinson on our team on the defensive side. And what this funnel represents are components of a detection and response program. So each stage is designed to filter out noise in a calculated way, and each step basically affects the ability for the future step to be successful. So any issues or failures that you have at any one of these stages, it definitely affects your program. So a huge benefit with having a concept such as this, it allows us to diagnose at which stage or stages that the breakdown in your defensive program is happening, such that we could come in and very tactically fix those problem areas and try to make sure that the funnel isn't clogged. So not pictured here, just feedback that people have given based on the blog post that Jared has released probably like some time ago. One thing that's not pictured here is a feedback loop that occurs pretty much between each stage, right? So you have something here like some incident that happened, went all the way to the remediation stage. That's definitely going to affect the collection stage where you might want to onboard additional data. But then you'll have, as a result of that, additional detections such that you either prevent the activity that happened before from happening, or you try to detect things higher up in the attack process, the attack path, right? So that's a funnel of fidelity in a nutshell. With that, we are going to move into the various aspects of the funnel of fidelity, first starting with collection. So we like to think of collection as the building block for a detection and response program, and it definitely affects each stage. So we all know it's pretty hard to detect or respond to malicious activity if you're lacking logs, but definitely centralized logs for the data sensors in your environment. You might be asking yourself, well, what the heck is a data sensor? We like to define a data sensor as being anything that generates data, whether it be software in the form of an EDR, right, endpoint tooling, or in the form of hardware, let's say a network appliance, right, that's providing you flow data, or network tab providing you with additional network metadata. So centralization of logs is definitely the first step, but there are other aspects of collection as it relates to maturity of a program that we want to consider. One being documentation, but then also standardization of logs. So one example that I like to throw out there is that you may have Windows event logs, for example, centralized, but for your 4688 logs that deal with process creation, you might have a completeness gap if you don't have command line logging for those, right? That's something that's not enabled by default. And then the second piece to that for standardization is I want to point out 4648 logs where these are for explicit logons with explicit credentials. And it's sometimes tricky to decipher if you don't have documentation around the fields, specifically fields like subject account name and also target account name. Those get pretty confusing, and people usually flip-flop the definitions of what those mean, especially when in the heat of an incident. With that, here are some considerations that you should take into account, especially while your team is operating remotely. So you should be thinking long and hard about bringing additional logs in. When we collect logs, we want to collect logs with a purpose, and we want to constantly ask ourselves, is there a specific reason we're bringing in the logs that we're targeting, right? You want to ask yourself, what will the logs help you to detect? Maybe you tried to detect something in the past and concluded that you couldn't based on lack of logs, right? Or maybe those logs were just local and it would be better for your detection and response program if those were hosted centrally. And in my experience, the problem for a lot of organizations isn't that they don't have enough logs, is that they're not utilizing their logs to their maximum capacity. So what type of logs should you be collecting at a minimum, especially for remote operations? Well, one, you should be collecting email logs, right, in the form of headers, attachments, things of that sort that you can build detections off of, and we'll get into that in the next slide. But then you should also have VPN and proxy logs. Those become increasingly difficult, increasingly more beneficial as you have users that are off of the local network and logged into VPN, right? And then you want to have network metadata. You want to see north-south traffic, east-west. You're probably interested in that as well, but that's hard for a lot of organizations to get done correctly when on-site, but then more of a nightmare when you're working remotely. And then the big stuff that happens on the host, right? Because a lot of detection these days have moved on to the host side of the house, only because there's a lot of rich data there. So you definitely want to have registry monitoring, process monitoring, and file monitoring. Registry monitoring more being focused toward Windows systems, but from Mac OS as well, and Linux systems, you want to take into consideration process and file monitoring into account. And process monitoring goes beyond just process creation. We also talk about in process monitoring, maybe a process accessing another process in the event that maybe something is interacting with LSAS. That is a process accessing another process, which that process being LSAS.exe. That's something that Johnny will speak to in a later session this week. So another consideration that you want to have when working from home is what happens if one of your data sensors, right? This is your hardware or software that's generating data. What happens if that goes down or becomes degraded or is severely impacted? How do you engage the team responsible for that? You should probably have a dashboard or two set up in your environment such that it tracks the last time that you saw an event from each one of your data sensors. On to the detection phase, which we believe is one of the most important phases, right? One, we don't talk about prevention a lot in these slides, but prevention is something that you definitely want to have in place. You want to prevent as much as possible, but then with that, you want to approach detection from the assume breach mindset, right? That the prevention mechanisms that are in place will eventually become circumvented or just will fail at some point, and you have to account for that and be expecting that. So this detection phase involves automated and manual identification of noteworthy events that you may have represented in log form, right? And this is being funneled from the collection stage. So this is where threat hunting or detection engineering takes place. As you research attacker techniques, you want to look for the evidence of those techniques being represented in the logs that you have. So we're taking the millions or trillions of events that we have collected, and we're filtering those into maybe hundreds of alerts to be triaged. So with detection in general, what we want to do is focus on attacker techniques as opposed to tooling or things that are more precise in nature, as far as like binary hashes or IPs or domains, things of that sort. So Jared and I also released a blog post a little over a month ago that talked about the detection spectrum. So this is a concept that we threw out there that basically signifies that every detection that you create, whether you know it or not, lives on a spectrum from precise to very broad. And so as you build detections at the technique layer, hopefully that allows you to build detections that have more of a balance between not being too precise, but then also not being too too broad. So one thing of note in this detection phase, something that's coming up later this week, Johnny will be talking about capability abstraction maps. And so he has one built out for LSAS. And what that's designed to do is help you to identify a choke point for attacker techniques, non-independent of the procedural variation of that technique. So for example, if you dump LSAS via proc dump, task manager, PowerShell, Mimikatz, right? There is a choke point that happens, and the capability abstraction map helps you to identify what that choke point is through research. So he'll talk about that later on in the week. Here are some considerations for detection as it relates to COVID-19 and teams that are moving to fully remote. So one, you want to utilize your email logs to start baselining emails that contain work from home pretext, right? So everybody's jumping to Zoom, Slack, Teams, whatever the new hotness is for work from home collaboration. You should be looking for external emails, excluding emails that come from, like Microsoft or Zoom domains or things of that sort, right? But external emails that contain some of these pretexts, that contain links or attachments. The same thing could be said for anything containing pretexts such as like COVID-19 or coronavirus or any of the public health or World Health organizations out there, because those are ripe for attackers to be using. And if you just scour Twitter, you see that there's an uptick in that type of activity taking place. So assume that your email filtering will fail at some point in time, and you want to make sure that you have sufficient coverage for that from a detection standpoint. Users are going to use their work computer for more than just work activities. This is a known fact. Just in my experience doing security operations and incident response, users already, when they weren't in this remote format, would take their computers home and do like a number of weird things on their computer, acting like if it's their like actual computer, their personal computer. This activity is most likely to spike as you have people who are just going to be using their computer in off hours to do a number of different things, log into personal email, access additional websites, whatever it might be. With that being said, in unison with the attachments that you might see from email, you should be looking for specific file types in users downloads folder, maybe a temp folder, and like app data specific to Windows. And then also suspicious process creations from those folders, and also network connections from Office products, PDFs, etc. One thing too that I wanted to note was the use of VPN logs. So this is something that has worked for me in the past, where you can take a look at established sessions within your VPN logs, and then taking the public IP and mapping that to geolocation. So that being said, the thing that you're trying to detect are two different IPs being used in a short period of time relative to geographical destination, right? So if I'm logged on to VPN in Washington, DC, and you see another established VPN session from California in a 2-hour time span, well, we all know that it's not possible for me to get from Washington, DC to California, and there's a chance that my credentials might have been compromised, right? So with that, preventative, you might want to have two-factor for that, but in the event that you don't, you might want to assume that credentials could be harvested and attackers are sitting on them for this specific instance where people are starting to work from home and they could blend in quite a bit. The one challenge with this are definitely VPNs, personal VPNs that people are using, and then also cellular networks that people use for connectivity. And the last bit here, basically intel or research-driven detection explorations, where you target in on a specific industry vertical, let's say healthcare. And for example, healthcare right now, a lot of healthcare organizations are dealing with the Ryuk malware. And so Red Canary and Microsoft has basically posted two blog posts pretty recently that outlines the techniques that are used leading up to that ransomware attack. So if you double down your detections to build detections for those techniques in place, you could catch that activity before it ends up to be something where you have to respond to for remediation or engage additional business partners to take something offline or pay ransom or whatever the case might be. So these are two aspects of detections that don't really get talked about enough, I feel like. But when you build detections, it's not enough just to build them. You have to actually go ahead and test them, because there's some detections that you build that you will never encounter unless those techniques are in use. So if it's not in use, then you need to know that that detection itself is still working as expected in case you come across an attacker using that type of technique. And there's a number of ways you can do this. There's like open source, like Circle CI to do some of this testing, or there's a few vendors out there that live in this space to do unit tests for detections, and then also in-house solutions that you might draft up on your own. So you have to decide if you want to go manual or automated with this. And then as you do these tests, take a look at the logs that are generated and see if they differ between when someone is remote versus when they're on site, and if there's any gaps in the data sets. And then documenting detections. This is another piece where our team exclusively uses Palantir's alerting and detection strategy framework for doing this, where you want to make sure that your most junior analyst or someone else in your InfoSec organization can take a look at the documentation for your alert and feel comfortable enough to triage that alert with little to no explanation as to why it's created, and then the background of why we're attempting to detect this in the first place. Moving on to the triage stage. So in this stage, our goal is to identify if a given event or series of events are benign or malicious, right? And sometimes they're neither, they're just suspicious, in which case they move on to investigation. But we want to know, hey, is this thing a true positive or false positive? And because all detections are not perfect, you will have false positives that arise. So dealing with a high number of false positives, we all know could lead to alert fatigue and eventually analysts becoming burnt out. But another thing that isn't talked about as frequent is alert ambiguity, right? An alert fires, you don't know what to do with the alert. You don't know how to triage it. So it just sits there in the queue for hours, days, months, and you just leave yourself open to whatever that technique was that was used coming into play. So this definitely highlights the importance of the previous phase where we're documenting and testing our detections. So these are some of the considerations for work from home while dealing with COVID-19. Definitely keep an eye on the alert queue, the time between alert generation and the start of the triage process, only because it's easy for analysts to become sidetracked with distractions at home, right? You might have analysts that never worked from home before. And then also you have the advent of COVID-19 and just loved ones. There might be personal things that pop up that, you know, maybe their mind is elsewhere. So you have to reach out and make sure that everything is in line and you're making sure that everyone's taken care of from a mental health perspective as well. Just don't assume that it's your employees like slacking off. That speaks to the next point where you want to keep open lines of communication, especially between analysts, right? So if you're on a team, check in on each other, and then especially check in on your junior analysts, because me doing security operations and in the past, I know it's very easy for junior analysts or even senior analysts to get spun up on a particular alert and be triaging that for hours at a time and not noticing that, or not roping in additional help to try to get some different perspectives on whether this is a false positive or true positive, or what the next steps are. So especially for managers, me being a manager myself, reach out to your staff and make sure that, hey, like if they have any issues, you're helping them through that, as opposed to just assuming that they're slacking off. So the next phase is investigation, and there's a number of different factors you want to take into account with this, especially working remotely. But here we're definitely interested in determining if a suspicious event is actually malicious or not. And with this phase, you're going to be collecting additional information that doesn't loan itself to being centralized at scale. So your teams need to find a way to interrogate these systems while remote and at scale. And live response, for example, falls into this category. So with that, does your team have a way to interrogate systems remotely? And when's the last time that this has been tested, right? Do you have alternative plans in place in case the normal way of interrogation isn't sufficient? Perfect example here, right? And I have another example after this. What happens if you're in the heat of investigation, determine if a user took a specific action on a system, right? Executed a binary, maybe you're not collecting prefetch logs at scale centrally, right? So you typically use an EDR to do live response and to get a shell basically to the system and navigate around, right? But because connectivity is an issue for that remote user, right? Maybe they're in some rural location, you're not able to do that. So it's good to ask yourself, or as a team, ask yourself, well, what do you do in the event that this is the case, right? Are you able to engage the engineering or network team to make a switch, maybe to something like PowerShell remoting in case something like that happens? These are things that you should be thinking through. So this last phase, remediation, becomes increasingly difficult. Remediation is stressful enough as it is, but this is in the unfortunate event of confirmed malicious activity. So with this, everybody being remote, you lose the benefit of in-person coordination via like war rooms to get all the details straight. And it also becomes harder for everybody to get on the same page, right? You either have to find something like video conferencing or tell everybody to go into the office for the folks who are critical to the incident to actually go physically into the office. So tension and stress are already high at this point, and they could be compounded by the fact that your team members don't have access to systems or technologies that they would have if they were in the office. This might be related to forensics in the event of like write blockers, or this might be software, right? Maybe you have to go grab a dongle that you just don't have access to for forensic capabilities to help you with this remediation process. But just keep in mind that tension is already high through all the stuff going on with COVID-19. If you have an incident, remediation wise, be patient with each other, and then also understand that communication could become an issue. So this last piece here, so how does your incident response plan account for work from home? How do you handle containment? How do you handle communication within your team, outside of your team? And then also an important aspect to note is out of band capabilities, right? What does your out of band communication looks like? As far as coordination and decision-making, with remediation, what you are doing is making sure that the stakeholders responsible for the business piece have all the necessary details they need in order to make an informed decision about what needs to happen from a remediation standpoint. That being said, those details become blurred if you don't take into consideration the best way to communicate while remotely, making sure that those stakeholders have all of the information that they need. So with that, that concludes the webinar. I've covered a number of aspects of a detection and response program as it relates to working remotely, and also some additional considerations that will be expanded on throughout the rest of the week. With that, we have a bunch of different topics that will happen throughout the rest of the week. Tomorrow, we'll have Andy Robbins from the adversary resilience side, basically sharing everything you always wanted to know about Bloodhound, but were afraid to ask. So with that, thanks for joining me today. And at this time, I'll take a few questions before we end the session. So one question that we have here is, do you find many cases of ad hoc collection for data hunting? Not quite sure.
Richie, this came up when you were talking about the collection phase. I think the question is specific. Do people ad hoc collect data for a specific hunt, or do you see them? I think that's the question.
So what we've seen in a lot of organizations is that they take a look at the data that they have first, and then say, okay, like what type of techniques can we detect with this data that we have existing? But there is value in maybe identifying some techniques that you're interested in and realizing that you don't have the data for that, and looking to see how you can best onboard that data, maybe in like an ad hoc way, right? There's always requests that come down from upper management to say, hey, I heard about this type of attack. You guys need to make sure that you guys and girls need to make sure that you can be able to detect this. How do we go about detecting that? And you realize you don't have the logs to do so. So that's that. I'm going to take one more question. Let's do two more questions before we end the session. So do you see collecting prefetch useful when you've already collected EDR logs, which contains processes executed? So this is in the event that, let's say, for example, you have an EDR appliance, right, sitting on a system, an EDR sensor sitting on a system that you got maybe a process execution for, or maybe you got an antivirus alert that says X system, has this executable that attempted to execute, right? You go, you ask yourself, well, what are the different executables that executed out of this path that was listed in an antivirus alert? And with that, you discover that, hey, like the EDR sensor for this system of interest hasn't reported back in X amount of days. And so you missed that completely, which is why you probably would want to go and grab something like prefetch. Collecting prefetch could be useful for like centralized data, but prefetch, in my opinion, is really focused toward that investigation stage where you're just trying to gather the additional details around what happened. So there's another question here. Okay, so one person asked, what is the difference between detection engineer and threat hunter? In our opinion, there is nothing, there's not too much of a difference between the two. Usually the task of threat hunter aligns with a detection engineer. So the detection engineer is going to be responsible for building out a detection using the data sources you already have available to you. And in the process of doing that, they are going to take a approach that people align with the threat hunting process, where they are proactively trying to detect something that there's currently no detection for, or they've assumed that the control that will prevent that technique from being successful is circumvented, right? So there's not much difference between the two. Us as a team, we're kind of moving away from the terminology of threat hunter and more along the lines of detection engineer, as we think it's a more complete definition of what that role entails. And then I will have one more question. So one person asks, what do you consider are the 3 top techniques to hunt for? Specific to COVID-19 and people working from home, I would definitely say double down on phishing pretext, right? Looking for initial access mechanisms. So this is attachments, these are links, and then additional things that might be downloaded or new domains that appear in the environment that haven't appeared previously. Another thing to note is credential access. So mapping back to MITRE ATT&CK, credential access, taking a look at those techniques. During the attack lifecycle, credentials almost always comes into play. So I would say that's enemy number 2. And also if the third thing for me is persistence. So any of the persistent mechanisms or techniques that are outlined by MITRE ATT&CK, those are definitely in play, especially as adversaries look to gain access to a system and live there for some period of time, knowing that the advent of like VPN connections and users' instability as far as connectivity goes is something that they have to take into account. So I would definitely consider that to be the top 3 techniques to hunt for right now. With that, we've run out of time. Any additional questions, feel free to maybe send them to Twitter and we can start a conversation there. But with that, I would like to thank everyone again for joining, and I continue to hope that your loved ones and yourself stay very healthy and safe during this pandemic that we're dealing with. Thank you.